This is where the fun begins.
The bizarre trajectory of Sega's Dreamcast is really the kind of thing they should be teaching in schools. I mean, here you got a platform which really just should have been an outright success, and yet it ended up becoming yet another in a line of poorly selling consoles, despite coming from one of gaming's biggest powerhouses.
Talk about low-budget flights, no food or movies, I'm out of here!
A lot like the Saturn before it, where the Dreamcast really shined was in its many arcade ports, with titles like House of the Dead 2, Crazy Taxi, Soul Calibur, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But then it also boasted an impressive library of its own, with exclusive titles like Jet Grind Radio, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, and what a lot of people consider to be one of the best Resident Evil games with Code Veronica. Weirdly though, despite there being over 600 games made for the platform, only a dozen or so of these were first-person shooters, and it was a genre that seems to be mostly overlooked. A part of that might be due to the fact that FPS games are kind of unpopular in Japan, but I can't help but also wonder if it had something to do with that incredibly clunky controller, which really doesn't lend itself to cohesive movement where shooters are concerned. Seemed that Sega was so adamant to make their console unique that they defied what was already becoming commonplace with the whole legacy control layout, giving their controller a thumbstick on the left side, but then also removing the second thumbstick entirely and devoting the right side of the controller to face buttons. This meant that for FPS games, you had to use the left thumbstick for aiming and then the right face buttons for moving and strafing.
What? No!
Which is completely backwards and just makes FPS games very uncomfortable to play. The solution to this is the Dreamcast's official mouse and keyboard. However, even this wasn't perfect. Firstly, because only a handful of games even supported those attachments to begin with, but then secondly, because you're really at the mercy of the quality of the peripherals themselves. Now, a few of you younger viewers might not know this, but back in the day before mouses all had lasers, they used to use balls. Yeah, not the kind your mum gargles. And if any kind of dirt or dust or anything got into these things, well, you could literally feel that going over the mouse as you moved it around, which would instantly mess up your movement. This meant you'd have to constantly remove the ball and give it a clean, blow into the hole and try to clear the whole thing out, which was a constant, never-ending nuisance. And going back playing these games now with an older mouse like this, just reminds me of how good we've actually got it these days. It's just another example of one of the many first world sacrifices I've had to make for the greater good of this channel. And I not only did this for one game, but for more or less every first person shooter they made for the Dreamcast. Which, you know, I thought would make for a fun video.
They're waiting for you, Gordon. In the test chamber.
Admittedly, this ain't going to be the longest list, and you can count all the titles in this video on pretty much two hands. But, you know, let's check it all out regardless anyway, shall we? If nothing else, just to really try and shed a bit more light on Sega's underappreciated console swan song. 3, 2, 1. Start! Right, so first up, we've got an all-time classic. And I will admit that I am kind of cheating with this one, simply because the Dreamcast port of Half-Life was never officially released. But all the same, it's never been any kind of secret that developers Captivation Digital, along with Gearbox Software, were working on it, alongside the version we eventually got for the PS2. And grabbing a copy of this unfinished prototype, or beta, or whatever it's supposed to be called, is pretty damn easy as well.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional.
Now, all this was ever intended to be was a port for the base game, and on that level, it does its job just fine. You've got that opening sequence on the tram, followed by exploring the Black Mesa facility and donning that iconic HEV suit, before then playing your part in one of the worst workplace incidents of all time.
My God, what are you doing?
Thankfully, Captivation was smart enough to include mouse and keyboard support with this one, which instantly alleviates the issues of having to play through this with the controller. And also as well, like this version is very similar to the PlayStation 2 port, using a mixture of both old and new models, updating the weapons and characters. I also think this whole cheat code system is really clever as well, using phrases instead of all these elaborate inputs. The cheat code to warp to the opening chapter, Anomalous Materials for instance, is Gordon Goes to Work, whereas the one to warp to the We've Got Hostiles chapter is Soldiers Visit Black Mesa. It's almost to the point where you could guess some of these too. I mean, On a Rail as an example is Trains and Rockets.
That's a good idea.
The main problem this port has though is the performance, which is just absolutely horrible, with the frame rate often feeling like it's dropping down into single digits. Now this makes aiming hard, it makes platforming and movement hard, it really just makes everything hard in general. And by the time you get to the surface tension chapter where you're outside and getting into combat with half a dozen soldiers and enemy vehicles, the whole thing just becomes more or less unplayable. Saving your progress is incredibly resource expensive as well, with save files taking anywhere from 80 to even 100 blocks of that Dreamcast VMU. I mean, like, as a point of comparison, right, most other games take anywhere from 10 to 20. There's no kind of autosave or checkpoints at the start of the map transitions either, so when you die, it's going to throw you all the way back to your last hard save point.
Good morning, and welcome to the Black Mesa Transit System.
But considering the whole thing is literally unfinished, it is probably safe to say there that all of this would have been ironed out for the official release, you know, had we ever got it. The long and short of it though is that it eventually got cancelled after numerous delays, and the eventual downfall of the Dreamcast as a platform is the main reason attributed to this port's demise. But you can't help but kind of wonder just what effect it would have had on this dwindling console had it actually seen the light of day. But I guess, along with Half-Life 3, that's something we'll never get to experience. Right, so up next is what's easily one of the most obscure and less known titles on this list, and that's Kiss Psycho Circus, The Nightmare on Elm Street Child, developed by Third Law Interactive and Tremor Entertainment. This one's got a pretty interesting premise based off the comic book of the same name, where you play as the different members of a Kiss tribute band who all get imbued with elemental powers and then have to fight back against some kind of ancient evil that's taken over 4 different realms. I think.
You must make a mad dash through the gargoyles' arches to reach the salvation that lies at its end.
Lady, you're scaring us.
I've often seen it compared to Serious Sam and Painkiller, which I've got to say is quite a feat, you know, considering it came out a year before either of those games. What it is really is just a horde shooter, where you move from level to level, taking out droves of monsters with different weaponry. Visually, it has a pretty cool vibe, capturing this kind of otherworldly chaos as you explore all these bizarre worlds and environments. And if gaming has taught me anything, it's that evil carnivals make the absolute best backdrops as well. Yeah, as anyone lucky enough to have played Carnival is going to attest to. The problem this one has though is that the whole thing is super repetitive, and once you finish that first chapter, of which there's 4 in total, it doesn't ever really offer up anything all that new or exciting. And despite playing as the 4 different members of the band, the general structure is still going to be the same for each of them, and they more or less have the exact same weapons too. So each character starts off with their own unique melee weapon, but then that's quickly replaced by the Zero Cannon, which is like a minigun of sorts that fires out ice shards. After that, there's what's more or less like a shotgun. You got a rocket launcher along with a whip, which also kind of doubles as a long-range rifle, and there's a means to grapple up to certain areas. And then finally, each character has their own unique sort of powerful weapon, which does insane damage and uses ammo from one of those other weapon slots. Throughout each level, you're also looking for the next piece of Elder armor, starting with the boots, the belt, mask, and cock ring, with each piece then giving you slightly more health points. And yeah, like, it does sound pretty fun, but it just really quickly becomes this mundane loop of doing the same actions over and over. And it wasn't helping either that you really only fight the same 3 or 4 enemies the entire time. Mostly just these guys here called the Headless. Yeah, these bizarre looking torsos with spindly spider legs that seem to come at you by the absolute dozen. Often out of these spawners, which would just perpetually spit these fuckers out until you destroyed it. Overall, like, I wouldn't say it was a bad game, but it was definitely superseded by the superior Serious Sam and his subsequent successor with Painkiller. How's that for some alliteration? I've even seen stories that KISS would just give copies of this game away for free at their concerts, which like some people might argue is part of the marketing, but I like to think it's because the game was so boring that the only way to get rid of it was to literally throw it away. Then when you consider that the Dreamcast port is just a worse off version all around, well then you can start to understand why no one ever talks about this thing. I mean, for starters, this version has no voice acting at all. All of the mysterious and captivating narration by that old fortune teller is replaced by, well, bugger all.
The Roadhouse. It all begins here. To call upon the Star Bearer, you must master his realm.
Meanwhile,
visually too, it looks far worse than the PC did, with a much blurrier image, and certain effects like the mirror reflections are just gone entirely. The frame rate is also super inconsistent, with it being really sluggish at times, again bordering into being unplayable. And there was even times when it would hard freeze my console, you know, like full on freeze, causing me to have to power cycle. It is also too like a super dark game by default, with there being no option in the game to adjust it. And the only way that I could fix this was by bringing up the gamma levels on my upscaler. But even just the basic gameplay just feels gimped as well. For instance, all of the power-ups from the PC version, like those explosive jack-in-the-boxes, are just gone. Enemies don't have health bars, there's no option to quick save during levels, and the few KISS tracks we actually got are now completely removed. At the end of each chapter on the PC, there'd always be some kind of a boss fight to round out that character's arc, but again, this is something that seemed to get the chop, with the levels just kind of ending and starting the next chapter without any kind of explanation. But of course, the worst thing this port has going for it is the controls, really highlighting the clunky configuration of that Dreamcast controller. Again, making the shooting and just basic navigation a lot trickier than it needs to be. What I find even weirder though is that this game supports the keyboard but just not the mouse. Like, did the guy coding in all this stuff just run out of time or something? So what we're left with here is a bad port of a mediocre game. And although the PC version might have had some merits here and there, they're all but lost, like Tears in Rain on the Dreamcast. Still though, it is nice to see a video game that gives your mum a bit more visibility. Now the next title in the list is Maken X, something which I almost have to talk about simply for the fact that it's really the only exclusive first-person game the Dreamcast has.
Maken, Deus Ex Machina.
Developed by Atlas, known for their work on, among other things, all 42 games in the Persona series. And if you know a lot about their library, well, then the art style in this one alone is going to be instantly familiar. As will the absolute batshit insane writing and dialogue, a lot of which either appears to be lost in translation or is just a result of bad localization.
Shah Rukh, the big TV star in India, defeat him. He sends radio waves through TV that steal people's souls.
You have our thanks for flying the deadly skies and, by the way, prepare to die.
Either way though, this is a really bizarre game, where you're playing as Kay, a 16-year-old schoolgirl, classic, who's bonded with the eponymous Maken, which is some kind of artificial being that has the ability to take control of a person's body. The world in Maken X is one that's in complete turmoil, you know, kind of like real life, with there being growing tensions between the US and China, and then all of Europe being in a complete state of disarray. So, again, yeah, kind of like real life.
How about we go to another city?
And with Kay as Maken's host, you travel across the world enlisting members from two different factions, the Blade Masters and the Haki, to then defeat some kind of super powerful deity known as Geist.
We've got to put an end to Geist before it's too late.
Traveling to areas like Moscow, London and Athens, making it too easily one of the better looking and running games on the platform. What is kind of odd though is that some of the cinematics are fully 3D, whereas the others are basically 2D slideshows.
What the hell?
but the running theme that they've all got going on is that they're all completely unhinged, with these flamboyant and cartoonish characters you interact with all looking like a bunch of rejected Digimon villains. And that's actually one of the core mechanics of the game, where throughout the campaign you're able to frequently interact with and jack into the minds of all these people, all who have different weapons, abilities, and BJ ranks? What, a BJ rank?
Oh my.
And yes, I know it's short for Brain Jack, but I'm not about to step on the toes of a good blowjob joke. Now, truth be told, Maken X isn't so much as a first-person shooter as it is a first-person hack and slash, with the gameplay being mostly melee weapon focused. Each character you brainjack into has a different kind of base weapon, and then there's a few simple mechanics you'll also need to get the hang of, the most important being blocking and leaping. Now, blocking is pretty much essential for obvious reasons, and then leaping can be done to get over and behind an enemy, leaving them wide open to a critical hit from the back. You can also deflect certain attacks, but this seems far too inconsistent to me, and I think you'd have a better chance of deflecting back raindrops with a pair of chopsticks. So most of the combat is really just about blocking attacks and then parrying, or jumping over someone and then hitting them from behind. And then the boss fights mostly repeat these same ideas, but just on a much more difficult scale. Where the variety starts to come from though is within all these different abilities for all these various characters. Like one of the Blade Masters, for instance, has a charged up attack that can freeze enemies into blocks of ice, and then a quick follow-up hit is going to instantly shatter them. I mean, what is this, Hexen? Another Blade Master has the ability to hit every enemy on the screen with a lightning bolt, which is easily one of the best powers in the game. And then to balance this out, you lose health points every time you use one of these abilities, preventing the player from just spamming that over and over. And overall too, like, it is worth noting that Maken X is a surprisingly challenging game. Things start off pretty easy with the first few levels being a total breeze, but then there's like a difficulty spike about 5 levels in that is very noticeable, and then from that point on, like, the whole thing just becomes relentless. You do get the odd health kit here and there throughout the environments, but not understanding the basis of the combat system or knowing the attack patterns for these recurring enemies is only going to let you get so far. The problem though is that this game uses what's more or less tank controls, which means you can only move forwards or backwards along with turning left and right. You can technically strafe around an enemy once you've locked onto them, but if there's more than one of these guys at once, well, then that whole system starts to go to shit. Because there's no way to switch between targets outside of turning lock on off and then back on again and hoping it locks onto someone else. The super low FOV also makes it really tricky to see nearby threats, and the lack of any kind of instant 180-degree spin forces you to manually turn yourself around, which just feels incredibly slow and clunky. It's also packed with a lot of dumb, old-school game design shit as well, like the complete lack of checkpoints, forcing you to replay entire levels in one go. There's really annoying enemy designs here as well, like kamikaze dogs, kamikaze planes, or how about these guys that are like pinstripe wearing mobsters with butterfly wings? What?
Right.
Probably what I find the most annoying though is that you can't skip cinematics. So every time you replay a level, you've got to sit through that same 60-second long intro for the boss fight all over again.
You know, I don't want to be your girlfriend anymore.
What the hell are you talking about?
But I will say that trying to summarize Maken X in a video like this isn't entirely fair, because truthfully there is a whole lot of stuff going on with this one, and the frequent narrative choices easily outweigh those minor gameplay grievances.
I hate doing this, but I have a favor to ask you.
And that's because throughout the campaign, you're frequently having to make yes or no decisions during dialogue checks, all of which then go on to affect the rest of the story in some pretty profound ways. To the point that there's 7 or so possible endings you can get in total.
Are you willing to go to India for us or not?
You'll need certain characters to access certain side areas in certain levels, but if you haven't unlocked these characters because you've somehow missed that opportunity, well, then you're kind of screwed for the rest of that playthrough.
I see. It's all clear to me now.
So honestly, it's like, I'd probably need to do a full video on this one to truly give it the credit it deserves. And even in that 5 or 6 hours I spent with it, I still felt like I'd barely scratched the surface of how deep this bizarre nonsensical iceberg went.
Artificial gods will reign over this world.
Bye. That was fucking brutal.
Up next is a game called Outrigger, originally developed for the arcade by Sega AM2.
Out, trigger.
Yeah, the same crew responsible for such absolute bangers like the Virtua Cop and the Virtua Fighter series, not to mention motherfucking Daytona USA.
Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines.
And this one is a really good example of the way the Dreamcast was able to effortlessly bring across an arcade title and get it running on a home platform. I actually have some pretty vivid memories of coming across this arcade cabinet back in the day, and I remember too how it had this incredibly awkward upright stand which really made it about as comfortable as sticking a cactus down your pants. So the benefit of being able to play it comfortably at home, along with the fact that it includes mouse and keyboard support, makes this Dreamcast port a far more attractive option.
Good job.
There's not really any kind of overarching story for this one as far as I can tell. You're just playing as one of 4 members of an anti-terrorism squad, taking out enemies in a whole bunch of different maps. This equates to just a series of death matches, where you get anywhere from 45 to 90 seconds to kill 10 enemies, with each kill giving you a 5-second bonus, and that's really all there is to it.
Good job.
Despite there being 4 characters to initially choose from, all of them are really just the same, with the differences being purely cosmetic. And regardless of who you play as, every character gets what's more or less a rocket launcher, an automatic weapon, and then a bunch of grenades. There's weapon pickups on some of the maps, like a flamethrower for instance, but there doesn't seem to be any real reason to use anything other than that rocket launcher, simply because this one does the most damage by far. As this is an arcade game, that also means that it comes with arcade game difficulty, and even on the so-called normal mode, our trigger gets insanely hard very quickly. With the later stages not only making the enemy AI way more mobile and accurate, but also giving them a bunch of more health points. And whereas 1 or 2 rockets might have killed someone before, now it takes like 4 or 5. Yeah, fun. There's a so-called training mode here too, but all that really would have done is to train people to not be stupid and waste their pocket change on a tutorial mode in an arcade game. Because all that mode offers is really just kind of like a glorified shooting gallery that's impossible to fail.
Good job.
The Dreamcast port does offer up an exclusive missions mode, which is a couple dozen different challenges, most of which are just derivative of the arcade portion. Things like having you running around collecting medals in a time limit or killing more terrorists.
Good job.
And one of the other modes here is basically just kill confirmed, where you got to grab coins from fallen enemies to increase your score.
Good job.
That trigger's biggest problem though, is that you are going to start to see the lack of content really early on here, with there only being a handful of maps and none of them being all that memorable either. It often feels too like these maps would have been more suited to 1v1s. Yeah, 1v1 me bitch. But then instead, you've got like 4 or 5 people running around at once, which just makes the whole thing feel very cramped. I mean, it's like a deathmatch set inside a 1-bedroom apartment.
Good job. Good job.
Shut up!
You can't skip through the death animation either like you can in other games like Quake 3 or Unreal Tournament, so when you are fragged, you've just got to sit there staring at your corpse for like 5 seconds until you finally respawn. The mission mode does offer up a bit more extra content, but all you're really unlocking there is more cosmetics. Even making your own character from scratch is really just choosing from either a male or female preset and then giving them a loadout based off the other characters. I also find it incredibly weird how I can't pause the game at all, which I guess on some level makes sense considering it's based off an arcade game, but to lack such a basic feature on a version made for a home console, it's just kind of baffling. If you had a couple of mates around or connected to the online mode, I guess I can kind of see where you'd get some value here, but ultimately this thing would just be overshadowed by the vast superiority of Unreal Tournament and Quake 3. Yeah, which speaking of, is the next game in the list, with the Dreamcast port being developed by Raster Productions and released in the year 2000.
Ooh, that's tight. That's beautiful. That's nice.
And one that's actually a pretty damn good version too, with it being about as close as you can get to the PC without actually playing it. Now originally released for the PC in late 1999, id Software's Quake 3 Arena is largely responsible for popularizing the online shooter genre, along with being just a real pioneer for arena shooters in general. Safe to say that without it, games like Fortnite, PUBG and Warzone would never exist. In fact, specifically Warzone, considering earlier versions of the graphics engines used in the COD series were derived from the id Tech 3 engine first used back in Quake 3. And it's always been kind of funny to me how Unreal Tournament also released within months of Quake 3, with the argument over which one is better being like that never-ending debate on whether brunettes are better than blondes, or boobs are better than us. Oh yeah, brunettes are better than blondes, by the way.
It's true, but he shouldn't say it.
Anyway, you've more or less got the exact same game here. You've got all the same character models to choose from, all the same game modes, weapons, and maps. In fact, they've even included a bunch of Dreamcast exclusive maps to play through. There are minor factors to the single-player component that have been changed though. For instance, instead of fighting Sarge at the end of the first tier, you're now fighting Anarchy. And the regeneration power-up on that map is replaced with a quad damage. And then, instead of fighting Hunter in the next tier, it's now Klesk. Overall though, not massive changes or ones that really impacted in a bad way, but, you know, worth noting. Visually, it does look good, but it's definitely not as sharp or crisp as it was on the PC. And the frame rate, while mostly solid, does take a bit of a hit here and there, but never to the point that I found it to be an outright handicap. And either way, you can still see Lucy's cellulite-ridden ass cheeks, which, let's be honest, is all any of us are really here for.
You're goddamn right.
The main visual thing I noticed though was that in the tutorial fight against Crash, they've removed that mirror that you see when you first load in. Yeah, I don't know, what is it with this console and mirrors? Thankfully though, this is yet again another shooter on the Dreamcast that supports the mouse and keyboard, making movement and shooting, not to mention just basic menu navigation, much faster. Thank God. As for the actual downsides, well, the main one I guess is that you're far more limited in creating your own custom matches, with the bot limit being 3 here, whereas on the PC you could have upwards of a dozen. Sonic Mayhem's awesome soundtrack, which is arguably one of the best of all time when it comes to arena shooters, is replaced as well by one composed by none other than Aubrey Hodges. Yeah, the same guy who worked on the soundtracks for other console ports as well, with Doom on the PS1 and Quake on the 64. And I wouldn't say that these new tracks are bad, but they're definitely just not the same kind of vibe. Some of them honestly sound like something out of an old Power Rangers episode. Like I'd expect to hear them in the background while the Rangers are beating the shit out of a guy dressed up as a giant lobster, you know what I mean?
Somehow I expected more from you, Power Rangers!
A lot of those original Quake 3 maps are so memorable to me because of the backing tracks. It was almost like a running commentary to the action itself. I do think there are some downsides though if you compare it to the version on the PS2, considering that that version was a really good crossover between Quake 3 but also Team Arena, including new game modes but also weapons from the latter.
Excellent.
Still though, it is kind of hard to faulty what they've pulled off on the Dreamcast, and this is absolutely one of those situations where if this was the only way you could play some Quake 3, well then that's hardly a bad thing. And in fact, I was still surprised at just how much fun this game is once you get back into that familiar rhythm. All the muscle memory of grabbing certain weapons or power-ups on some of the maps, along with Phobos being a great example of an early game filter, is something that never dwindles. So overall, Quake 3 on the Dreamcast, it really hasn't aged a day. Yeah, just like Lucy's ass. Now, the original Rainbow Six is widely agreed upon to be one of the pioneers of the tactical shooter genre, and went on to become a highly influential title that led to multiple sequels, spin-offs, Rule 34 animations, and ports, with the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast being the first ones in line.
Man down, got him.
On the one hand, you've got the PlayStation port, which was pretty much an entirely different game, with highly simplified missions, a limit of only 3 operators, and the inclusion of actual first-person weapon models. Whereas the ones on the 64 and the Dreamcast followed much closer in line with that original PC version, with the Dreamcast in particular again being the closest to the PC. This is also too one of the few times where that controller doesn't actually handicap the controls. I mean, it'd still be nice if we could play this with a mouse and a keyboard, but the slower and more methodical nature of the gameplay means you're less likely to be fumbling around under pressure, at least where movement and shooting are concerned. The issue though is that they still had to map a couple dozen or so different commands and inputs within the limitations of just how many buttons there actually are on that controller. And as a result, there is a whole heap of combinations and commands here which are just really clunky to pull off. I mean, for instance, to simply activate night vision, you press down on the D-pad and then the X button. To give the go codes, you hold the left trigger, the start button, and then press A, all at the same time.
Alpha, go.
I mean, even just to reload a weapon, you need to press down on the D-pad and then the A button. And it's like they've all just been kind of mapped at random, not really making all that much sense.
Alpha, go. Got him.
So if you're going to play this one, I suggest you do what I did, which is to have that manual handy nearby, because believe me, you're going to be glancing over at it a hell of a lot. The only other complaints I'd have for this one more stem from Rainbow Six itself and not the Dreamcast port specifically. And that is, like, simply put, you've got to accept the fact that you're playing a really old, early iteration of a military shooter, back from when it was still just a burgeoning genre. And despite Rainbow Six having this incredibly detailed planning system, where you can control every aspect from the kind of guns and armor your operators wear, through to even their movement speed and rules of engagement, that even the absolute best laid plans can still fall victim to those evil gods of RNG.
Man down.
And with a foolproof system of go codes and coordinated strikes, your operatives are still going to frequently get wiped out by some lone terrorist that they just refuse to acknowledge. But then you'll replay that same mission with the same plan a second time, and it's like they've all turned into John Wick, mowing down the bad guys the second they enter a room. One time I even saw Ding Chavez kill 3 terrorists in a bar with a pencil. With a fucking pencil.
Fucking pencil.
Still though, this is hands down the best console port of that original game. That is, of course, unless Ubisoft somehow bring it back in some kind of anniversary edition or something. But I think there's a high chance of them making a new Splinter Cell game than there ever is of seeing that happen.
Its codename is Rainbow.
In the year 2000, we eventually got the sequel, Rainbow Six Rogue Spear, which in a way as well is a good example of why bigger is always not necessarily better. And I say that because, although this one added in more complex environments and missions to get through, it also seems to have come at the expense of the AI. And I don't know if this is limited to the Dreamcast version, because truth be told, I haven't played the PC one that much. But it just seems like random mission failures are far more common here in Rogue Spear than they ever were in the first game, which leads to a lot of frustration.
Mission failure.
It is sadly too one of the Dreamcast titles that runs like complete shit. And compared to the first game, the frame rate is downright sickness-inducing. As in, it makes me sick. Makes me sick! I mean, it definitely looks better than Rainbow Six, but is there really any kind of point to a visual upgrade if it's going to come at the expense of basic performance?
No!
This one actually supports the mouse and the keyboard too, which, yeah, is a nice addition, but funnily enough, I actually found it easier to still use the controller. Simply for the reason that this port's got a contextual menu from which you can access every single command and mechanic, from giving the go codes through to changing your stance or vision mode.
Bravo, go, move it, move it!
Well, I don't know, maybe by this point I've just been like fully indoctrinated to appreciate the controller.
It's okay.
If nothing else though, the mouse does become useful when navigating menus, during the planning aspects of all the missions, and it does make it easier to restart as well after your 20th death. So yes, not all bad.
Mission failure. A hostage was killed.
So as far as tactical shooters named Rogue Spear released for the Dreamcast go, this one's easily in the top 2.
Ready?
Up next is one of my all-time favourite old-school shooters, and that's Raven Software's Soldier of Fortune. One of the first proper violent games I ever remember playing, and one that to this day is way more fun than it has any right to be. Originally released for the PC back in 2000, it has you playing as mercenary John Mullins, who, yeah, no way looks like Captain Price from the Call of Duty series. globetrotting with his buddy Hawk to stop a terrorist organization from releasing some kind of biological weapon.
Sources in Russia report that an unknown organization stole 4 nukes from an underprotected stockpile near Kazan last night.
Yeah, so the plot's about as original as a 90s action movie, but what really made this one stand out was the ghoul damage engine, which affected how enemies would react when you shot them in some pretty cool ways. Like shoot someone in the head for instance and it would leave an exit wound, or shoot their hands or feet and you could remove them entirely, with that kind of surgical precision that only a Spaz 12 can provide. Oh yeah, and the shotgun in this game? Damn son, truly one of the all-time best boomsticks in all of gaming. If nothing else, easily one of the most underappreciated. And that opening level set inside the subway station where you're dissecting the body parts of these countless skinheads has to be up there with the best openings of all time. All up, it was a fun and brisk experience, and it got 2 console ports shortly after hitting the PC, with a version released for the PS2 and then also the Dreamcast, with that version being worked on by Runecraft. And while that name might not sound too familiar, it is worth noting that these guys worked on the awesome Men in Black Crashdown for the PS1, along with the seminal Barbie Super Sports a couple of years back. Though if the views on my Barbie video are any indicator, well, then no one gives a shit about that game either.
Radical!
Anyway, whereas the PS2 version was, and still is pretty damn awful, really just feeling and looking like what happens if you ran the PC game on the lowest possible settings, the Dreamcast port is, yet again, pretty damn close to the original. I mean, obviously it doesn't look as sharp or as crisp as its PC counterpart, but with the advantage of being yet again another title that supports the mouse and keyboard, it really ain't the worst way to experience John Mullen's violent escapades. I have seen a whole lot of people talking smack about this version to the point that I really went into this one expecting the worst. But outside of a dodgy frame rate in a few areas and loading screens that at the worst of times made me somewhat impatient, considering that this is a console port, it's really not as terrible as some people make it out to be. Most of the gore effects seem to be still intact, with the damage modeling being more or less identical.
I'll be damned.
And about the only thing I noticed is a weird cutaway during that opening cinematic, where it seems to refrain from showing Decker executing that random NPC.
Kill Saber, you've killed the gang. Kill Saber, you've killed the gang.
I will say though that the one thing that does put a thorn in my dick hole is the lack of quick saves or checkpoints. But then, considering most of the levels are broken down into shorter segments, I don't think it's that much of an issue. I can't really comment on what this thing would be like without that mouse and keyboard because I dare not even try it, but I'd imagine it'd be like trying to give someone a prostate exam while wearing oven mitts. But I can say that with the mouse and keyboard, it really just feels like I'm playing a slightly crappier version of a great game. So yeah, you know what, loading times aside, this one right here, it's okay in my books. Sadly though, now we're going from one really good military themed shooter to one that's really not very good at all, with Spec Ops 2 Omega Squad, which is a really early example of the whole mil-sim genre. This time with large open maps for the player to explore and a somewhat less linear mission structure, dropping you into these expansive environments and letting you choose your own path. It's just that most of these missions aren't all that great, and you're mostly just moving through these empty areas, getting into the occasional gunfights with enemy soldiers. There's different classes to choose from, like infantry, close quarters, demolition, and snipers, but all this really affects is your starting loadout, which is completely customizable anyway. And seeing as almost every single mission has combat which takes place at medium to long range, there's really no reason to not bring a weapon that doesn't have some kind of a scope. I mean, bringing a machine gun or a shotgun, for instance, is fine and dandy, but it's not going to do you any good if the enemies are all hanging out in a different time zone. Oh, I do find it hilarious too how a lot of the weapons use that old stock 357 Magnum sound effect that I swear showed up in every single Newgrounds.com animation back in the early 2000s. Sadly too, there's no mouse or keyboard support, but again like Rainbow Six, I didn't find this too much of a huge dilemma, simply because the combat isn't that fast paced to begin with. I do find it odd though how you get this notification every time you kill an enemy, as if you're playing like a multiplayer shooter or something, which just kind of seems out of place given the game's strictly solo settings. Despite missions being set in entirely different countries like Thailand, Pakistan and Antarctica, all that seems to really change is the colour of the ground and mountain textures, and each country still has you cordoned off into these long-ass narrow valleys. They truly went from one extreme to the other as well here. I mean, that opening mission in Antarctica is about as bright as it gets, and then the next one after that in North Korea, where it's the dead of night, is completely pitch black. Oh yeah, and you know what as well? Like, night missions in this game really just do suck hot farts. And you're almost forced to play this entirely with those night vision goggles on, an effect which severely limits your FOV. To the point that it honestly feels like I'm watching bootleg colonoscopy footage, and yeah, not the good kind either. Some asshole thought it'd be a funny idea to place landmines around these areas too. Landmines which are about the size of your pathetic little pin dick, making them next to impossible to see unless you're constantly looking out for them. Which, you know, is kinda hard to do when the whole fucking thing is set at night time.
Honestly, every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way.
I often just found myself walking around a lot, not really sure what I was supposed to be doing. There is a map screen which does help here, but the objectives are often just kinda vague, giving you like a sentence-long description as to what you're supposed to be doing. Like, you might need to blow up some stuff with satchel charges, but it's not gonna actually tell you how many satchel charges you need to bring. And even during one of the first missions, like, I got lost searching through a bunch of buildings over and over for 20-something minutes. And then it seemed that almost at random, the game had decided I'd met the victory requirements, and then the mission abruptly ended.
Well, my work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
The one act of mercy that Spec Ops has is that it lets you play any mission in any order, removing the need to play through the whole thing in a linear fashion, which also means I can show off a whole bunch of varied footage without being forced to play through the game itself. All up, this is easily one of the worst shooters released for the Dreamcast, and I'd put it in at last place just behind Kiss Psycho Circus. So if you're wondering why you've never heard people talking about this entry in the Spec Ops series, well, want to know more. And this brings us on to the final game in the list, and that's another personal favourite of mine with Unreal Tournament. Originally developed by Epic Games and released for the PC in 1999. And still too, one of the absolute best of the arena shooters. With some all-time classic maps, classic game modes and weapons, like the flat cannon, which is still a force of nature, along with one of the most broken rocket launchers ever made, allowing you to load up multiple shots at once. Much like Quake 3, this also got ported to the PS2 and the Sega Dreamcast, with there being a lot of positives and negatives with each version. And considering they're really just both lesser versions of what we got on the PC, I thought it'd be far more interesting comparing both of these instead of just one of them. So for starters, in terms of the base content, the PlayStation 2 port has around 20 or so deathmatch maps, whereas the Dreamcast has over 40. Both versions come with Deathmatch, Domination, and Capture the Flag, but for some reason the Dreamcast port lacks the Assault mode. And then weirdly too, you can only choose to play as a male character in this version, whereas on the PS2 you had a whole cast of female characters to play as. On that note as well, the PS2 has some really cool portrait art for all of these, but on the Dreamcast it's just these flat, boring, low resolution images of those few 3D models. To make it even more confusing, both games share more or less the exact same UI, but where visuals and performance are mostly concerned, I'd say the Dreamcast version looks better but runs worse, with the frame rate here being honestly some of the worst I've ever experienced on the platform, making precise aiming more or less impossible. I mean, trying to hit enemies sometimes feels like trying to run over a cockroach with a concrete shopping trolley. I don't even know what that means. They include the Capture the Flag map, Facing Worlds, which is easily one of the most memorable and iconic maps from that original game. And the best way to describe how this is incorporated here is brave but foolish.
Brave but foolish, my old Jedi friend.
And again too, there were a few times when the game just outright froze my console.
Ouch!
Both versions of the game support mouse and keyboard inputs, so it's kind of redundant to bring up those controls. But if we're looking at each of them in regards to their respective controllers, well then there's no competition, man. Like, the PS2 wins hands down.
Learn how to aim!
I'd even say that the layout of the DualShock controller is second only to playing on a mouse and keyboard, and is about as good to control as first-person shooters ever got outside of that. So overall, like, what it really comes down to is whether or not you prefer more content over stable performance. But considering this is a game that almost entirely relies on quick reflexes and smooth movement, you'd be justified for putting the PS2 above that Dreamcast version.
Too easy.
I will say though that both of these versions censor those wall boobs in that tutorial map. Yeah, on the PC you can still see those warlocks as clear as day, an event which no doubt turned many a boy into a man. Whereas on both the PS2 and the Dreamcast, those bad boys are hidden away. Yeah, hashtag free Unreal Tournament. I don't think Cliffy B is going to be losing sleep over both of these versions either way, and at the end of the day, these games still serve their purpose and turned a few more people into Unreal Tournament fans, which is really all that matters.
Congratulations, you are the winner.
And there's still a damn sight more fun to play through than Unreal 2, that's for damn sure. And with that said, we're at the end of the video.
Good job.
I hope that if nothing else, I helped to bring a new appreciation to some of these older, forgotten titles. And if there's any other consoles or things you'd like to see me cover, well, be sure to let me know in the comments section below.